Katie, thank you very much. I'm Jeff Wilgus from NOAA's Performance Risk and Social Science Office. And in January of last year, the White House launched the National Strategy to Develop Statistics for Environmental Economic Decisions, which provides guidelines to create a national system for natural capital accounting. Natural capital accounting involves assessing the total stocks and flows of natural resources and services in a region. Unlike traditional economic measurements, natural capital accounting integrates nature into the balance sheet. In this way, it recognizes the value of ecosystems and considers their contributions to our well-being and to our economy. By doing so, it helps us make informed decisions about sustainable resource use and management. NOAA is the national strategy lead for the development of natural accounts for oceans, and NOAA's Performance Risk and Social Science Office, or PRSSO, has been steering this effort and collaborating with experts from NOAA Fisheries and the National Ocean Service to develop pilot accounts. PRSSO has recruited Dr. Charlie Colgan, who has previously helped NOAA develop the Marine Economy Satellite account, as the technical lead in the development of these pilot accounts. Charlie is the Director of Research at the Center for the Blue Economy in the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California. Charlie is a true pioneer in the field of ocean economics, and he has been studying the economic value of the ocean for 4 decades. He is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Ocean and Coastal Economics. Before his tenure at Middlebury, Charlie served as a professor of public policy at the University of Southern Maine, and he was also the chair of the university's PhD program in public policy. Prior to this, he served in the Maine State Planning Office, and he was the state economist and the director of natural resource and economic policy. It is my pleasure to give the floor to Charlie so he can present NOAA's work in piloting ocean natural capital accounts. Charlie, thank you very much for presenting this work today. The floor is yours.
Good morning, afternoon, whatever time zone you're in. Appreciate your stopping by for a little bit for us to talk about this project, which is really just at the beginning of a fairly long voyage. So this is a subject that has actually, there's a lot of really technical economics involved, which I intend to spare you from almost all of. The basic ideas are actually pretty simple, and whatever your background is, I think you can get the basic ideas without much difficulty. And I'll try and stay away from the really thorny issues that we're wrestling with as we're trying to do this. So let's ask the question, what's the value of the ocean? And by ocean, I want to upfront say ocean in this context also means the Great Lakes. Okay. I don't want to have to say ocean and Great Lakes every time I say that. So forgive me if you're from the Great Lakes, but you are included in this, but I'm going to use the word ocean through this simply to save time. So there are a number of ways that we can answer that question. We could ask, what is the value of the goods and services that come out of the ocean? We could ask, how many jobs are associated with producing those goods and services? We could ask, how much money do people earn from providing those goods and services? And that's in fact what we do with the accounting measures that relate to the GDP and national economic statistics that we've been developing for a long time. So if we look, for example, at what's the value of the product, we have something called gross product, gross output. The number of jobs we can count in different ways, and the income earned comes out as wages and salaries and other kinds of data. Now, all of that is being produced out of a resource base that is the ocean, Great Lakes, and coasts. So the ocean is providing us with resources essentially for free. The fish are there, provided for by nature. The beaches are there, provided by um, millennia of coastal geologic change. The oil and gas is there because of changes in the farther distant past. So, what's the value of those resources on which the production jobs and income are based? And that's really the question that we're trying to get at today. What is the value of the nature supplied capital on which we rely for the production of a variety of goods and services, some of which we are familiar with, and some of which we are only beginning to learn about? For example, we are only beginning in the last 20 years or so to really understand the economic value of wetlands, which were once considered wastelands and open for, good only for development. Um, the There's a history to this. In 2001, 23 years ago, I and a colleague started something called the National Ocean Economics Project, where we began to develop a regional level construct of the ocean economy. And in 2011, NOAA took that over. NOAA had provided us with the funding for a lot of our work, but in 2011, they took over the production of the data as the research phase of that largely ended, and I was happy to give it to them. So they began to publish that data under something called the Economics National Ocean Watch. And those of you who work for the federal government recognize how something gets an acronym attached to it, and the acronym stays forever. So the acronym in this case is ENOW. In 2017, Congress provided funds to create a national marine economy satellite account, which had one big advantage. It had much more detail in terms of industry, but would be only at the national level. In 2020, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, with a team from NOAA and some outside people, including myself, produced the Marine Economy Satellite, which has been produced every year thereafter. Um, and the Marine Economy Satellite account is a more fully integrated with the national income accounts, so that you could compare the ocean related activity with other kinds of economic activity. As Jeff said, in 2023, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Department of Commerce put together the national strategy to develop statistics for environmental economic decisions. And that led to this project, which is just completed its first year of a planned unknown number of years, but will stretch into the future. So just to take a quick look at the Marine Economy Satellite account, the definition is this is marine dependency. It takes place in the marine environment, or is located in proximity to the marine environment, or uses essential inputs from the environment, and produces goods and services predominantly for use in the marine environment. So there are companies like Garmin in Missouri who are part of the marine economy. Because they make all that navigational equipment, even though they are not necessarily located in a marine dependent region. Our coverage is the waters of the U.S. You're all familiar with this. We are looking right now at the Atlantic, Pacific, Great Lakes, Gulf of Mexico, Arctic. We will extend this in the future to the territories. Later this month, the first ocean economy estimates for the territories in the Pacific and the Caribbean will be announced. That project's been going on for 3 years now. We're a ways away from the natural capital extensions of those, but we will get there. The natural capital work we're doing is connected to what is already being estimated in the Marine Economy Satellite Account. And there are 10 sectors: living resources, research and education, professional and technical services, marine construction, national defense and public administration, offshore minerals, marine transportation, ship and boat building, tourism and recreation, and utilities. Our pilot work is in 3 of these areas: living resources, offshore minerals, and tourism and recreation. And I'll describe more detail of that as we go through. So here's the slide I showed you a little bit earlier. What is the value of the ocean? Well, let's just look at what MESA says about gross output. This is the total value of sales of the companies in this area. So offshore oil and gas, this is for 2021. Offshore oil and gas, $93.7 billion. Commercial fishing, $12 billion. Then tourism and recreation is broken up into several categories. It's a very complex subject. So there is coastal restaurants at $18.6 billion, coastal hotels at $68 billion, and beach going, spending on activities related to the beach at $308 million. But what then is the value of the oil and gas from which that 93.7 billion was produced? What's the value of the fish stocks? And what's the value of the beach as opposed to the value of the beach going experience? And this is what brings us to natural capital, which is, there are a lot of definitions for this. I'm going to pick one from the Natural Capitals Coalition, which is a group of researchers in the US and other countries that has been studying natural capital for about a decade. Natural capital is another term for the stock of renewable and non-renewable resources, e.g. plants, animals, air, water, soils, minerals, that combine to yield a flow of benefits to people. Okay, that's a pretty good definition. It's very similar, it's almost identical to the definition of other types of capital: physical capital, houses, real estate, fishing equipment, financial capital, stocks, bonds, and so on. They're all about the accumulation of a set of values that produces other value into the future. That's capital. And nature provides a big part of that, and that's what we're trying to estimate. Now, I want to emphasize that this definition is perfectly sensible and understandable, but turning it into actual measurements is a different matter entirely. And unfortunately, that's our task. So to see the challenge ahead, take a look at this picture. So the picture on the left is of land that has been developed. It's got houses and it's probably got some commercial establishments. And then there's a river that runs through it. And on the right-hand side of the picture is the vacant land. It's almost entirely open. You'll notice some wetlands, some scrub forest land, and some open meadowland. Probably doesn't appear to be used for farming. Maybe a little bit down in the far right-hand side. So, what's the value of that vacant land? Think of this problem as the value of the natural capital problem as the value of that vacant land. So there are a couple of different ways to think about it. So if we allowed development to occur, as we apparently did on the left-hand side of the picture, then the value of that land is essentially the residual value after we paid to build all of those houses, etc. It would include the cost of providing the infrastructure, the roads, water, and sewer. We'd have to pay construction costs. We'd have to pay development costs. The cost of land should therefore minimally be what the developer would pay for the land after all the development costs were recovered at projected prices that would still make money. And that payment is called the rent. And rent is a term that confuses people mightily. It has been confusing generations of economics students. Rent in this case is not what you pay to temporarily occupy or use a piece of capital. Rent in this meaning is the value of the land or the land or the natural resource that is left over after you have paid all of the other costs, including the ability to earn a profit. Now, so we would value the land on the left at what was called the fair market value, and that's in fact what we do for property taxes. So we're all familiar with that idea. What if we left the land vacant? Well, is the land vacant open for development? If it is, then it's probably valuable the same way the land on the left is. But if it's not open for development, if it's conserved, then the value is not zero simply because it can't be developed. The value is the flow of ecosystem services from the land that's there. And we group ecosystem services into three broad categories: producing, regulating, and cultural. That's the value of the natural capital, is the flow of those services from the land that is in its undeveloped state. And we are kind of balancing we'll eventually come to conserve land versus develop land. What we're looking at right now is the value of the natural ecosystems and services they provide, whether the land is developed or not. And we'll explain that as I go along. Now, I got to say something about discount rates, because we have to remember that capital is something that produces benefits in the future. How do we compare benefits in the future with benefits today? And the answer is we use discount rates. I won't go into the details, but let's just say that a discount rate is an interest rate, which is an alternative way of using money. So with a discount rate, you're essentially saying, well, what is the value of the flow of services compared to investing at some interest rate? So the interest rate is essentially representative of all the other things you could have done, except for the thing that you chose to do. So here's an example. This is, we're going to talk about the value of beaches. And we've done a study of 5 LA County beaches. If you look here on this graphic, the blue line represents the value of the beach, and I'll explain how we do that a little bit later on, with just population growth. We escalated it by 0.5% a year out to 2050. We then discounted that value, which is the value that consumers would pay, would be willing to pay, but don't necessarily have to pay because it's a free beach. That's a concept called consumer surplus. So we ask, what's the value of the beach? Even if you didn't have to pay anything to use the beach, what's the value of the beach? And there's a bunch of methods that economists use to survey to get that data. Don't trouble yourself with those, though I'm happy to explain them. Just for the sake of illustration, the red line represents the future discounted at 1.7%, which is the current OMB recommended rate of discount for this kind of resource. And just for contrast, the green line represents 7%, which is closer to a private market rate of interest. The 1.7% represents the idea that the future and the past with natural resources should not be too different, because we're trying to save those resources for the future. So just keep in mind that with all of the numbers I'm going to show you, we are projecting forward and then adjusting back to the present when we calculate a capital value. So we have looked at 3 specific natural capital values. We're working on those for 3 specific ocean resources. The first, as I said, was minerals. And here we're looking at the Gulf of Mexico. And we were looking at the planning area, the Gulf of Mexico, and almost all of the production of offshore oil and gas in the U.S. takes place in the Gulf of Mexico in federal waters. This map shows the lands that have been leased by the Department of the Interior for the production of oil and gas. One of the things that we want to calculate in the natural capital accounts is we want to separate the physical amounts of good or service and the monetary values, and this gets to be tricky. But we can calculate with some precision the the known amount of hydrocarbons, oil and natural gas liquids, if you're picky, um, and each year those estimates are made by the Department of the Interior, and this graph shows that data arranged into four categories as set forth by the UN's system of environmental economic accounts. So the dark blue line represents the light blue line represents the opening value at the beginning of each year. To that opening value at the beginning of each year, we add new stock because new oil and gas is discovered. We take out a certain amount and we count for depletion. And those are the red line, the green line above the zero axis, and the red line below it. The red line below it is the depletions. So we add and subtract, and we come up with the closing value at the end of each year. And you can see how the red line, how the opening and closing values have changed over time. So each year, if we did a slice down through each of those years, we would have a value of for the amount of hydrocarbon reserves in the Gulf of Mexico. Now we got to figure out what the value of those reserves are, and this is where it gets tricky. You need to know something about how oil and gas is sold. Many of you probably know this, though it may be hazy, and some of you may not know about it at all. So basically, the U.S. government owns the seabed from 3 nautical miles out, 5 nautical miles, or 3 marine leagues in the case of Texas and Louisiana. I commend you to the NOAA library to figure out what all of that is about. It is not possible to know if there is any hydrocarbon present until you drill. Key fact: every time you are buying the right to drill, you have no idea whether you will find anything. You can guess at it based on remotely sensed, in this case, geophysical data, but you're guessing. So the Outer Continental Shelf is divided up into tracts of approximately 5,700 acres, and based on a 5-year plan, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management holds periodic lease sales, in which a number of tracts are offered for sale, and a sealed bid auction is held. The auction is based on what's called bonus, which is an upfront payment by the oil company of the amount of rent that it expects to earn from the oil and gas. And it needs to be the maximum amount in order to have the best chance of winning the auction. And bonuses, I don't know where bonuses are these days exactly, but bonuses routinely in the 1980s, for example, ran into the $500 million a tract. And you can do the math to figure out what the value is per acre. A winning bid gets the right to explore, drill for oil, and if they find oil or gas, they get the right to develop and produce and sell it, subject to additional environmental review. So that's the basic regulatory system. So you're an oil company. How much should you bid if you wanted to drill for oil in the Gulf of Mexico or the Pacific offshore California? The answer is you should bid your best estimate of the rent. You should give up all of the profits you would earn except for the exact an amount to just cover your investors' expectations. And in order to do that, you should bid the maximum amount that you think would be earned. And that becomes a market-based price measure of the rent, and is pretty accurate for the time and place that it is done. And in fact, again, the UN system of environmental economic accounting basically says that auctioning off the rights to a resource is the best way to measure its value. There are very few ocean resources that are sold on a pure auction basis. There are in fisheries, there are ITQs, and there are occasional um, auctions for other resources. But among all of the oceanic resource, and among all of them in the world, the U.S. system for selling oil and gas rights is the closest to a pure competitive auction market, because it's a sealed bid auction. Nobody knows what anybody is bidding until the bids are opened. So this got compressed a little bit. So on the left, you see the number of acres leased in each year. You see the active leases. An active lease is one where exploration, development, or production is taking place. A lot of the land out there is bought. It's held for 5 years. Oil companies have different strategies of when they will go about drilling. And it's perfectly possible for you to own a lease, never do anything on it after 5 years, unless you continue, unless you get an extension. The lease goes back to the Department of the Interior and goes back to be sold to another company in another auction at a future date. So active leases have stayed pretty constant. You'll notice the total number of acres leased has been declining. And that's even more so if you look at acres where bids per acre where oil is found. So if you look over on the right, you have the total value of acreage at winning bonus prices. So what we've done here is use what's called a comp. Any of you who have bought or sold houses, you've talked to real estate appraisers, and the real estate appraisers you've asked, well, what's my house worth? And what they will do is they will go out and look in the neighborhood, and they will say, we have this many sales of houses with this many bedrooms and in this location. And they will come up with a number that represents kind of the average of the values of the real estate in your neighborhood or in the neighborhood you're looking at. And they say, well, the comparable price here would be roughly this. And what we've done here is to value the real estate acreage of the seabed at the value of the winning bid in each year for the total number of auctions. Now, this makes a lot of sense in some ways if we were real estate agents. The problem is we're actually being asked to figure what's the value of the oil and gas. Notice I haven't said that. And that brings us to a conundrum. This is as far as we've gotten. We've done a lot of data analysis, but it turns out going from the acreage to the volume of oil and gas is an exceptionally tricky business, particularly because we don't know and cannot know by law what the oil companies thought about when they made their bids for the lease sale. That's all highly confidential information, as you could expect it would be. I mean, no oil company in the business wants to reveal its strategy for figuring out how much it's going to pay to its competitors, because that would give everybody a leg up in the competition, and it would become largely a matter of uh, trying to game the system rather than trying to reveal what the true preference is for having the land. So it's a tough situation, and I have to confess that we're at the prototype stage, and the prototype right now, I would have to say we have gotten it so that it can get off the ground, but it can't fly anywhere. Is my best analogy. We can float the boat, but we haven't figured out how to get it from A to B. And that's what we're doing in the next phase of the work is examining how all of this data can fit together. And as said at the outset, we are still in the experimental stage with a lot of these calculations. For fisheries, we're looking at the scallop, Plactopens magellanicus, found in a range from New England to the mid-Atlantic states. The scallop has a couple of very useful characteristics as a test bed. One is that it is very valuable. It's the second most valuable fishery in the Northeast after the lobsters. Secondly, it doesn't go anywhere. Scallops tend to plant themselves and stay there. So they're not swimming around, which means they're not swimming across state borders or international borders. Where they are is where they stay. And so that avoids a lot of complex calculations with stocks that swim, for example, across the Canadian border. So they are sessile, they're quiet, and very valuable. And as a result of that, we know a lot about the economics of them because they are very carefully regulated by the New England Fisheries Management Council and the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council. And the New England Fisheries Management Council has the lead on scallop regulation. So what's the value of the stock of scallops? Okay. Not the fish that are landed. We know what that value is because we keep very careful track of the pounds of scallops landed and the sale price. That's not the value of the stock itself of scallops. It's simply the value of individual transactions. Now it's useful, but it's only it's like asking, well, what was the value of the sales in a retail store without asking what's the value of the store and the land. So the question of fisheries brings us to a question of property rights. I mean, all of you know Garrett Hardin and the tragedy of the commons. All of you know the influence that idea had on the passage of the Magnuson Act, later the Magnuson-Stevenson Act, which established a set of property rights for the U.S. in the areas beyond the territorial sea. So all of you are familiar with that basic idea, and that's actually a really critical idea in the calculation of value, because we got to ask who owns the rights to those fish. And so in fisheries, in oil and gas, the government owns it. That's the property right. No problem. The government owns it. It sells it. In fish, the government doesn't exactly own the fish, but it sets the conditions under which they can be caught and sold. And so in the case of fisheries, we have property rights that can best be described as modified open access. Any of us can go into the scalloping business if we can get a license to do so. And so the government controls where we can fish, how often we can fish, and in some cases, the number of licenses. So what's the value of the stock that we are competing for? Well, the answer is the same as it was before. It was the rental value. But now we calculate it a different way because we don't go out and actually buy the right to fish for scallops. We could, under some regimes, that is in fact done, but not in most cases in the US, and certainly not in the case of scallops. So, what we do with scallops is we use something called residual value, which again is another one of the standard accounting methods set forth in the UN's uh, framework for this type of accounting. The table that I'm showing you here is taken from the most recent update to the fisheries management plan. I think it's Amendment 39 or 38 to the fisheries management plan for scallops from the New England Fisheries Management Council. And this analysis that you see here, which I will not spend a lot of time explaining, is their original analysis. And the number I want to draw your attention to is the number in red, which is called producer surplus. And that is exactly the same analogous number to the bid in the oil and gas case, except in this case, we are backing into it, if you will, by estimating the landings, the gross revenues or landed values, subtracting from those the trip costs like oil, fuel, etc., labor, and the costs of other kinds of capital, the fishing boat and gear. And we come down to something called producer surplus, which is essentially the rent. Now, you'll notice here that there are two values to the rent. $301 million under Framework 36, which is what they were operating under until until 3 days ago, March 31st, 2024. And we just switched over to the next generation of the plan, which is Framework 38, which begins 3 days ago, and will continue for another year. And you'll notice that the producer surplus drops from 300 million to 281 million. And if you look above, you'll notice that the opportunity cost of capital went up from 43 million to 53 million. That's an interest rate hike. That's the effect of raising the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. So if you take those two, I can explain all that, but I'm going to kind of skip over it. If we take the present value of those numbers, then we get to a present value of $6.6 billion for the stock of scallops at the 2023 framework. And if we adjust to the 2024 framework and their estimates, the capital value goes down to just over $6 billion. So essentially what's happening here is that the value of the stock is declining slightly because of the change in interest rates that affect the owners of the fishing vessels. And that's an important way of thinking about the relationship between the macro economy, between the overall economy of the US and the value of its natural resources. Those two things are connected, and the natural capital account is making those connections. Finally, beaches. So I mentioned we were doing LA, but we're also looking at beaches in New Hampshire. There aren't many of them. It's New Hampshire has 137 miles of coastline, if you include the Great Bay, but only 18 linear miles from Portsmouth to Seabrook. But much of that is beach, and much of it is highly valued and highly utilized recreational beaches. Now, when we finish our assessment of the value of beaches, we will look at we are focusing right now on recreational values, but we will move to other ecosystem services, including wildlife habitat, for shorebirds, for example, and flood protection, which includes the value of the beach as a natural infrastructure barrier to coastal flooding. We will be adding those values in the next year. So what I'm going to describe to you today is, again, um, a partial result, but it's the it's kind of the headline result for beaches, which is about the recreation part of the satellite account. This is Hampton Beach, New Hampshire. Many of you may have been there. I don't know. Um, it's your classic beach town. You've got a nice wide beach. You've got houses along the beach. This happens to be in addition to other things, that happens to be a state park, which means that we've got good attendance figures. Um, so there are a bunch of values. I mentioned consumer surplus. We want to ask, what's the value to the people on the beach? Obviously, there were not many people on the beach when the Google satellite hit this one. It was probably done in the fall if you look at the vegetation. And there may have been a few people on the beach, but they were so small you can't see them. Also, there's a value to the goods and services, the hotels. Look at all the hotels and restaurants that Google points out there. Those are there because of the beach, and we will try to estimate their value as well. So we got from the Department of New Hampshire's Parks Department the number of visitors. We converted that to visitor days because all of the valuation studies are done in visitor days. And it so happens that 10 years ago, I did a study of the beach-going population in Hampton. And so I know how many days on average they go to the beach. So we converted that to beach days. We took a $30 roughly value of the beach per day, which represents the consensus of a lot of the beach valuation literature, and the numbers that we got to here indicate that the recreational values alone of the natural capital of Hampton Beach is to is $182.9 million just on the value of the recreational users. There are other values together. Probably the when we get everything together, the total value of Hampton Beach, including all of its ecosystem services, will be somewhere around $500 million or so, using these assumptions. So, what have we learned from all of this? Yeah, we've learned a lot. We've learned that theory is easy and data is hard. Um, uh, which we sort of knew at the beginning, but as with all of these, uh, um, as with all of these, it's you never appreciate how hard it is actually until you get into it. Um, and Katie asked me to remind you that the question and answer panel is open. I'm going to close up in a minute or so. Scaling up is going to be a challenge. There's 650 or so federally managed fish stocks. There's 154,000 kilometers of beaches we have to study. Often it comes down to one critical number. What is the value of visitor days as opposed to visits? We need standardized accounting procedures for things like the time periods. And oceans, because they are oceans and are not conventionally distributed by property rights the same way things on land are, have some unique issues that have to be taken into account. There's actually a bunch of other stuff we've learned, but I will not bore you with the technical details of it. So we're summarizing this data right now. I just gave you a preview of what's going to be in our early paper that will be out for review sometime later this month or early next month. We're moving into phase 2, where we will extend our recreation and fisheries estimates and add new types of natural capital yet to be discovered. If you have questions, my email is there. You can scan the QR code if you want to learn more about the Marine Economy Satellite account. And here's Jeff's email as well. Either of us can answer questions, and happy to do so. Don't see anything in the Q&A.
Hey, Charlie. So we do have one in the Q&A. So I'm going to pop that up on the screen here. So our question is, the rent depends on technology. No vessels means we cannot extract fish. So how is it possible to separate the value of the natural asset from the value of technology without knowing the production function?
So let me, if I can, let me go back to, no, not that one. Go back to this one. Okay. So, what we are looking at here, we're kind of relying on the benefit cost analysis that the Fisheries Management Council has done, and they have imputed a well, they haven't really explicitly calculated a production function, but they have put the elements of the production function through the trip costs, the cost of capital, the cost of labor, and the cost of capital into an account for the fishery for that year. The value of the natural capital could alter, as I showed here. In this case, the value of one of the inputs, which was capital, in this case, the value, the opportunity cost of fixed assets like the boat and the equipment. When that changed, when that opportunity cost changed because of changes in interest rates, the value of the natural capital changed. If the variable trip costs, fuel would be a good example, changed greatly from year to year, or the value of labor changed greatly from year to year, that would affect the value of the resource. And so the production function is implied in the relationship between the valuation of the inputs, the valuation, and the residual producer surplus estimate. They do not calculate. You could, I mean, if you put all of this into a time series, you could run some of the conventional econometric statistics on it to estimate a production function, but they don't, because we are doing an accounting exercise where the value changes from year to year. That's the inference of the production function.
Thanks, Charlie. So we do have a question. It came from outside the question panel, so I'm going to ask it, and I had put it in the chat so the audience could see it as well. For beach recreation, is consumer surplus of beach-based businesses also part of the value of the natural asset?
So the surplus of the beach businesses is producer surplus, because they are producers. We are puzzling how to calculate that. We do have an estimate for the value of the gross output and value added of the tourism and recreation sector in Stratford County, New Hampshire. that's part of the ENOW data series I described earlier. For reasons you don't want to know about, we calculate New Hampshire differently than other states, but we get to the same idea. One of the things we'll be working on is translating that data into estimates for Hampton Beach, which means we've got to get down below the county level to the town level. And we think we're going to do that with property tax data. Then we need to estimate from the gross output down to the producer surplus. And our plan to do that is with data from the detailed input-output tables that the Bureau of Economic Analysis uses. So we do intend to look at the value of the beach businesses. They are the largest employer in the ocean economy is tourism and recreation, and we've got to be able to tell that story of the relationship between those values and the beach itself, and that's what we're headed for.
Thank you so much. So we have one more question, and I'm going to put it on the screen here. When regulating services are valued, you mentioned flood protection. What other protective services come to mind? Do we value those functions by the assets protected from past events or the future potential to conserve infrastructure?
So, basic rule of economics, costs always lie in the future. Anything that's in the past is the past. The past can be a guide to estimating the future, but we look in calculating capital value to looking as much as possible at the future. Now, the past can be a guide to that, but we do a lot of work in other contexts on the value of natural infrastructure in flood protection. We've done a number of studies around the country of wetlands and their value in protecting real estate values against flood. So we use we use current data about the value being protected, but because of sea level rise, we run scenarios under different kinds of modeling. We use several different types of model to try and figure out what the future might look like. And ideally, we try to incorporate the risks of the future in terms of potential flood hazards to the value in the present. We do that in other contexts, and we will apply some of those techniques here in the natural infrastructure element of the beach valuation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Charlie. I don't think we have any more questions. So if you wanted to go to your last slide again, just so we can see those emails and the QR code and have that be hanging out. Oh, we do have one question also coming from outside the question panel. Will different methods be used for fish stocks with and without a system of limited access rights?
Yeah. Well, my inclination is to say I have no idea. So we, as I said, the property rights issue is an important one. We've talked with some fisheries economists about this who are just as puzzled as we are, because the question of the natural capital value is not, in fact, one that comes up a lot. And so even people who deal with these resources on the economic value of these resources on a regular basis, such as the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, when we went to them and we said, well, we're trying to figure out what the natural capital of the oil and gas you manage is, the response we got was, what's natural capital? And these were the economists in BOEM who were responsible for running the auction system.
Oh no.
So we really are at the frontier of puzzlement here. Um, I think that we will probably um, there are a couple of different strategies we can use, including more of stochastic models of the values depending upon the rules of the limited versus non-limited access fisheries. And there's some other things that we have thought about but have not tried and probably won't try until we've got much better handle on the simple ones like scallops.
Thank you so much. I think that's going to be our last question because we are getting close to time here. So I will flip it uh, over to our thank you slide and say thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Thank you to our speaker, Dr. Colgan, sorry, and Dr. Wilgus for introducing. I hope everyone got their questions answered. And with that, I want to thank you all again and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everyone.